I did this collaboration with Marius where I tested different types of joiner for these edge clamps I was building. And he raffled off 5 of these to a viewer later in a live stream that we did. But he also sent 5 of them to me, and so I've got some too. Now these are really nice looking edge clamps. They just feel really nice, and I love how easily the handle spins on them. Everything Marius does, he does so much more meticulously than I do, but it takes him way longer. Now, having broken a lot of his joint samples, I also bought this rather expensive Bessey edge clamp to compare it with. He really wanted to see me break this one as well, and so I put it in my tester and clamped it to a piece of wood and basically yanked it off, figuring that might break it, but it didn't. It just kind of slid off. Now, it took 260 kilograms to yank it off of my test sample, and I was wondering, is that even realistic to crank that with the screw on here? So I tested that as well. So now with this tared, I can now start clamping. And we have 130 kilograms already. So that's 266 kilograms, which is as much force as I was able to get on there before. Although I did have to crank that pretty hard. And I think that's about as hard as I can crank it. Now let's just compare clamping with a bar clamp like this. Well, that's a fair bit of force there. Almost 300 kilograms. And the bar clamp looks a wee bit flexed, but I don't think it's permanent damage. There, now straight again. But after my testing, this gap in here was at least 1 millimeter wider than it was before. So I guess this frame had yielded a little bit, so I figured maybe it was close to failure. So I got the clamp back in my tester, and the width front and back is exactly 101 millimeters. And let's see, still at 101 millimeters. So I've done 10 pulls to about 250 kilograms on here, and these jaws are now about 0.5 millimeter wider than they were when I started today. So I've now yanked on this clamp about 30 times, averaging about 240 kilograms, and measuring once in a while, and it doesn't seem to be getting any wider, but I think if I can just more easily put cycles on there, this will fail eventually. These cams have held up very well against these repeated tests, but they do slip a little bit, which means this thing always needs to jack up quite a bit more to get the force, and I still want to explore the fatigue limit of this bracket here. So I put in there directly, which is not realistic usage at all, and I've also stiffened up my test frame a little bit, which means this jack won't have to push quite as high to get the same amount of force, which means I'll be able to cycle more quickly. So I've been running this 5 up and down cycles to 400 kilograms. 400 kilograms because the geometry is different without the cams. To get 260 pulling is 400 up here. And then measuring the size after releasing the tension. And every 5 cycles it seems to grow by about 0.1 millimeters, so this will fail eventually. And all that force is transferred with my screw jack with wooden gears, and surprisingly, there's no sign of wear on these gears, so they're holding up quite well. This clamp frame has been defying me because even yanking at this at 400 kilograms, I've yanked it about 50 times and it really hasn't budged anymore, so I upped the force to 450 kilograms, still no difference, so now I'm yanking at it with 500 kilograms, that's half a ton. Well, it's too bad I didn't have the camera rolling, but my test apparatus failed a little bit, minor failure. This bracket here basically just split apart where the nut was in there. That was yanking half a ton. Maybe I should call it a day. Maybe this thing is just strong enough. So it looks like this one is about as strong as 5 of these together, but I'm not entirely sure because I haven't broke it yet. As for the limits of these, it turns out to be the rubber at 65 kilograms. Marius tested it and the rubber started coming unglued from the wooden cam here. So I don't really want to break one of these, but I figure a 40 kilogram test should be fairly safe. So after a few minutes, it's settled down at about 20% less force. I wonder what happens if I tighten it to 40 again. We were at 44 briefly, but it's drifting lower again. So if peak was 44, we've lost about 20% again. So these hold fairly well, but they drift a little bit. Let's try that with the Bessey. And let's crank that up to, let's say, maybe 100. Okay, 108. So we're also now seeing a drop in force on here, but quite a bit less than I did with this one. And my suspicion is that this grip material on here has much less give to it than the rubber on here. So Marius also sent me some of this rubber, which is the stuff he used on his clamps. So I'm curious now and put some rubber on here. So I'll have a layer of this rubber underneath the jaws for this Bessey clamp. Let's see how that does with the two materials together. And let's crank that to 40. And what's interesting now is we're seeing this drop off by 20% in much less time than I did when it was on Marius Hornberger's clamps. So that's dropped off much worse than I saw with these. Let's crank this up to a bit more, let's say 60. Okay, overshot a little bit. And our clamping force is now dropped in half. We're down to 36, 37 kilograms. So this rubber doesn't seem to be very good at this sort of thing. Let's try to tighten that up some more. Let's maybe take it to 100. There. So it would appear that this rubber is not very good for edge clamping at high forces. It's fine if you're clamping to 40 kilograms, and these ones, you don't really want to take them beyond that because the rubber starts coming off at 60. But I think this rubber is still much better than much softer inner tube rubber that I've used in previous tests. So let's try with inner tube rubber on here. Okay, now with the inner tube rubber in here, let's take it to 100. And the drop off for this material is quite a bit worse than the rubber on Marius's clamps, even though I had actually a much wider chunk of rubber in there. So a soft rubber for high force edge clamping is not a good material. And this stuff is actually a pretty firm material. It does have some give to it. You can see it flex when I push a screwdriver into it, but it's much more firm than this material is. So I guess soft material is really grippy at low forces, but at high forces you just need something harder. As for using edge clamps myself, I almost never just put straight up edging on a piece of wood like that. I almost always use the opportunity to add reinforcement to the edge and make that edge a bit thicker by adding an L-shaped profile. So for example, on this table, the edging is actually basically this shape here. And in terms of edge clamping, that this would barely fit in one of these clamps here. But then we find this jaw is hitting the edging as I clamp it. So that kind of bypasses pushing against the plywood. Although it would have just barely worked with the bigger edge clamp so that I don't actually hit the jaw just yet. And pretty much every time I've added edging, it's some kind of stuff that is L-shaped to give me a bit more, and sometimes even to add width to it because the plywood wasn't big enough. Same thing on this table here because this particle board is not very strong, so having the edging really reinforce the edge is very important, and it gives it that nice pleasing thickness too. And I think the only time I haven't had my edging overhang on the bottom is this bandsaw table because this is 2 layers of plywood, so it's thick enough. And so it just goes on the edge here, and edge clamps would have been handy for this because when I glued this up, I glued 2 sides with the clamps reaching to the other side, and then I had to wait for that to dry before I could do the last 2 edges. And these are experiments I kind of enjoyed, but I just couldn't find any sort of remotely clickbaiting narrative to it, which is why this video probably won't get that many views, and I know you guys will comment, it's like, but I watched and I find it interesting. True enough. But there's all these people that didn't, and of course they don't comment because they didn't watch it.